Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the life, death, and personality of George Carlin? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of George Carlin, then I'll move to my analysis. George Carlin was born in Manhattan on May 12, 1937. His father was an advertising manager and his mother was a secretary. When George was 2 months old, his parents separated due to his father's consumption of alcohol. His father died when George was 8 years old. George went to Catholic school and was expelled from high school at age 15. He joined the Air Force and served at a base in Louisiana, but he was not a very good fit for the military. He was court-martialed 3 times before receiving a general discharge in 1957. George Carlin found work as a DJ at a radio station in Fort Worth, Texas. It was there in 1959 that he met a man named Jack Burns. They formed a comedy team, moved to California, and were featured on a morning show. The partnership dissolved after 2 years. After this, George started appearing on television variety shows and became a frequent performer and guest host on The Tonight Show, first with Jack Paar, then with Johnny Carson. The routines performed by George were traditional. He dressed well and was clean-cut. In 1961, George married a woman named Grande. They will go on to have a daughter. In the late 1960s, George embraced the counterculture and drug use. He changed his image accordingly. Now he was wearing a t-shirt and blue jeans. He grew his hair long and grew a beard. George had been making about $250,000 a year, but after this transformation, he lost about 90% of his income. He mostly worked in smaller clubs. The people in charge of television shows and larger venues simply weren't interested in his new counterculture image. His comedy style involved a number of rants where he ridiculed and criticized politicians, organized religion, and big corporations. He was also a master of wordplay and had many jokes that did not have any connection to social or cultural commentary. Generally, George's comedy was about how he felt like American culture was terrible. George advocated for illegal drug use, yet criticized the pharmaceutical industry. George struggled with his drug use during this time and at many times during his life. He was particularly fond of cocaine, but he also used drugs like LSD, marijuana, Vicodin, and alcohol. Over the next few years, George released several comedy albums. He developed one famous routine known as 7 Dirty Words, which led to his arrest in Milwaukee in 1972. He was not convicted. In 1973, a man complained about a similar routine performed by George Carlin. This eventually led to a Supreme Court ruling which upheld the power of the FCC to prohibit indecent language. Even though this was a defeat for George's ideology, it brought him a lot of popularity. On October 11, 1975, George Carlin hosted the first episode of Saturday Night Live. He was starting to enjoy success with his new image. Unfortunately for George, he badly mismanaged his money and ended up owing a substantial amount of money to the IRS. He would later say that it took him about 18 years to rectify his financial failings. In 1976, George stopped performing regularly, perhaps due to his increasing use of substances. He had a heart attack in 1978. He would later have continued heart problems, including 2 more heart attacks. George returned to the stage in 1981 and enjoyed some success over the next few years. In 1989, he appeared as Rufus in the movie Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. 2 years later, he would appear in the sequel, Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. In 1993, George starred on a TV show called The George Carlin Show. It was canceled in 1995 after 27 episodes. George's wife Brenda died of liver cancer in 1997. She had consumed a lot of alcohol during her life. George remarried about a year later in an unregistered ceremony. After Brenda's death, George's comedy routines took on an even darker tone. Instead of simply being against all types of institutions, he appeared to be against the idea of humans existing at all. He talked about how he wished natural disasters would wipe out many people. George Carlin routinely alienated his audience when he switched from one stage of his career to another, But during his final years, he pushed a number of people away because he was offending just about everybody. He not only attacked the political right, which was one of his favorite targets, he also attacked the political left, including environmentalists and those advocating for political correctness. I think most people from both sides could tolerate his rants up to that point. They understood that he was a comedian who exaggerated for comedic effect. But toward the end, George was extremely cynical, self-righteous, and condescending. During a performance in a Las Vegas casino in 2004, George repeatedly insulted people who traveled to Las Vegas. He didn't seem to understand the expression, "Don't bite the hand that feeds you." During the performance, a woman in the crowd yelled, "Stop degrading us." George invited her to conduct an indecent act involving his genitals. He was fired from the casino. One of George's representatives announced that George would be seeking treatment for an addiction to alcohol and prescription medications. For the next few years, George generally remained active, but his health was failing. George Carlin died of heart failure on June 22, 2008. He was 71 years old. Now moving to my analysis. George Carlin is more mysterious than most comedians. He is actually quite unusual. When people think of comedians, they often think of an artist who creates funny material so that people can have a good time. They are entertainers who create various narratives, including lighthearted observations about the human condition, funny anecdotes, and monologues that highlight others' illogical behavior. People typically view a comedian as being somewhat connected to the stories that they tell, but appreciate that the comedian is separate from those stories. Like who the comedian is as a person inspires their comedy, but the comedian largely remains distant from that work. Just like a painter is not their painting and a musician is not their music, a comedian is not their comedy. With George Carlin, however, many people wonder if his comedic narratives reveal his identity. I think because he was so angry, cantankerous, grumpy, and passionate in his delivery, this idea developed that he was speaking from the heart. Like he was serious when he said things like he didn't care about humanity and he rooted for natural disasters to be victorious over people. Here are my thoughts on the relationship between George Carlin and his work. George Carlin's career can be divided into a few distinct categories. I think that these categories corresponded to the inner struggle that George Carlin had at the time. As he was developing throughout his lifespan and facing different conflicts, his comedy changed to match those conditions. They reflected that struggle. His comedy was an expression of his efforts to resolve each of the stages of development. I will go through each stage of conflict that George had and talk about how it was expressed through his comedy during that time. In his early years, George had a young family and he wanted to make a living. His general discharge from the Air Force and his substance use meant that getting a job wasn't always easy. George not only wanted to survive, he wanted to be successful. He knew that the mainstream traditional route offered him the best chance of making money and becoming famous. I think his resolution for these feelings was to become a clean-cut, traditional, and family-friendly comedian who was featured on several television shows. He came up with funny skits that involved wordplay and witty remarks that were safe for almost anyone to watch. As we move into the late 1960s and early 1970s, George had achieved financial success, or at least he believed that he had. In reality, he had some very poor financial habits, which landed him in trouble with the IRS. But either way, he felt secure, and he was troubled by many of the changes and turmoil that were occurring in society at that time. For example, the Vietnam War, recreational drug use, the hippie movement, and the counterculture in general. George responded by growing a beard, growing his hair long, embracing drug use, and joining the counterculture. This was a rebellion against his first audience. He no longer connected with them. During this time, George criticized people who wanted to keep drugs illegal. He was basically a drug salesman on the stage. This made George feel good about his own reckless decision to use drugs. During this stage, George used cocaine, and his wife Brenda drank alcohol. Both of them used excessively. One could make a good argument that these behaviors ultimately contributed to their deaths years later. During the early 1980s, George was still addicted to drugs, but he was now displeased with his addiction. He felt betrayed by cocaine. Also, he was being chased by the IRS. He started to blame conservative politicians because they supported law and order. They represented the institutions that were chasing him down and punishing him. His comedy switched to match this conflict. He frequently criticized institutions that upheld the law, and he lost touch with a good portion of his audience. Some people were not happy about his political content, but I think most of his losses occurred because he used to be an icon of the counterculture, and their time was essentially over. George found himself without a large audience. He really struggled during the stage because his comedy wasn't connecting with people, and he was experiencing a lot of negative effects from using cocaine and other drugs. In the 1990s, George struggled with family issues, health issues, and to develop a sense of purpose in his life. He was trying to figure out the meaning of life and trying to rebuild his career. He wanted to have a legacy. He wanted to stand for something meaningful. George made a bit of a comeback during this stage by pivoting to content that was witty and clever, as well as featuring more jokes about religious beliefs. George became popular again because he seemed relevant and edgy, even though he was once again offending a large number of people. During the final stage of George's career and his life, he was really worried about dying. He just could not come to an adequate peace with this element of the human condition. He could not accept what he could not change. His work expressed his own feelings of confusion, terror, loss of control, and the unknown. George's humor was nihilistic, dark, desolate, and hopeless. He had given up on the world. He had given up on himself. He couldn't figure out the meaning of life, and he didn't want anything to do with humanity. His solution was to disconnect, to hate everything that he once loved. In his final years, he moved back to the idea of spirituality. George had made a journey from theism to atheism and eventually to deism. So moving back to the original dilemma, was George's humor an expression of his identity? I think it was an expression of how he tried to resolve his conflicts. In a way, he gave the audience a glimpse into an exaggerated version of his attempt to resolve important questions in his life. Taking a look at George's personality, he was high in openness to experience. He was artistic, creative, and intellectually curious. He was low in conscientiousness. He was reckless and impulsive. He had mid-range extroversion. For example, he was sensation-seeking, but he also had few positive emotions. George was somewhat disagreeable. I think he appeared more disagreeable on stage than he really was. And he was high in neuroticism. He struggled with feelings of depression and anxiety. Moving to the last item, was George Carlin a good comedian? George Carlin was a man who was plagued by addiction. Drug use was the central focus of his life. It destroyed his mind, his body, and much of his career. I think his drug use trapped him at an earlier stage of development. For example, he never reached a stage where it was about giving back to society. Amazingly, George was still able to be extremely functional and successful. He used his intelligence and wit to create some of the funniest routines of all time. Some of these routines were certainly nihilistic and dark, but again, I feel as though these were exaggerations. They were not intended to be taken literally. He may have maintained unusual, offensive, and sometimes illogical stances on social issues, but he was generally funny. Even people who were offended by him could appreciate his demonstration of wit and satire. I don't think George Carlin was a great philosopher. I don't think he offered a lot of value in terms of social commentary. No comedian has ever done that, in my opinion. Many people disagree with at least something that George Carlin said, but he was a comic. His routines should not be taken seriously. I think George Carlin was good at making people laugh. Some of his jokes may have caused people to think about society and culture, and that's a good thing, but his primary function was as a comedian. This is a role where he performed exceedingly well. I think that George Carlin was a comedic legend. I think he earned that place. There are not many comedians out there where people look at the world and what's going on and think, I wish that George Carlin would weigh in on this situation. His cynical and distrustful tone is sometimes just what was needed to get a good laugh out of these terrible circumstances that we see all over the place in society. George's career was a testament to the power of intellect and motivation to overcome all types of adversity For example, a lack of formal education, impulsivity and recklessness, a lack of knowledge about philosophy, out-of-control drug use, grief and loss, and negative childhood experiences. George Carlin may have been somewhat narcissistic and hypocritical, but maybe he needed to be to point out those traits in others and to warn the world about how dangerous those traits could be. Those are my thoughts on the life, death, and personality of George Carlin. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.